we get started, I just want to let all listeners know that in this episode of Conspiratus, we touch on a number of potentially sensitive topics, including death, mortality, and suicide. And so, we just want to give a fair content warning to all of our listeners. Please enjoy the episode.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Conspiratus. I'm here, Sunny Agarwal. Nate's not here again this time, but I'm here with Eric Meltzer, who is founding partner of Primitive, and he also runs a cool newsletter called Proof of Work. Eric, I don't know, who are you?
Yeah.
He is definitely a maximalist of the city of San Francisco. That's what
I don't know if I'm a city maximalist for sure. I think cities are like the crowning achievement of humanity, and I feel really depressed every time I'm not in one for very long. But yeah. I mean, I went to. Right? I'm not. No, you caught me out in the boonies, and I'm doing this podcast over a tethered phone connection because the Wi-Fi out here sucks, which is one thing I hate about not being in a city. I basically need. I'm really lucky in San Francisco. My neighbor feels the same way as me, and so he ran like his own fiber line directly to our building that didn't used to have fast internet. And so like he's my ISP. He's like an ISP of one, and I pay him for like absurdly fast internet. But yeah, I mean, so I don't know. I'm a city enthusiast. I run an early stage venture fund with Dovey Wan called Primitive Ventures. I do have a newsletter called Proof of Work. A lot of people ask me if we only take proof of work projects. That is not the case. It's just a joke that like the point of the newsletter is that people send updates on the work that they've done for the past week. We have plenty of proof of stake projects in there. You can check that out. It's proofofwork.news. And then the thing that's been taking most of my time recently is I'm doing this crazy game called Satoshi's Treasure, where we're giving away $1 million of Bitcoin and then actually a bunch of other coins fairly soon to whoever can figure out this very complicated series of puzzles. So if you can find like 400 keys, which we've hidden out there in the real world and on the internet, you can get the private keys for a lot of Bitcoin. And so we got a bunch of people playing that as well.
Do you know where all the keys are?
The current answer to that question is yes. In that we've only released
you and torturing you considered a valid strategy?
So I think it would be an interesting strategy. I think it would probably be a really bad move because we now have like 100,000 people playing the game, and I would say at least 50% of them are scary ass motherfuckers that are like expert hackers and wilderness people. And like I think if I got kidnapped, I would end up getting rescued by a bunch of hunters like very quickly. Okay. So there's a nice balancing act there. All I'd have to do is tell them I have like 10 keys on me, and an army of nerds would descend.
Man, okay, 100,000 people. Let's assume that like 0.1% of people are like kind of insane. You might have 10 insane people after you.
Yeah, I mean, so the thing is, I'm not gonna like. I know where all the keys are now because we haven't released very many of them, and I've been involved with all the clues. But we're actually, now we're kind of diversifying the set of people that's involved with clue generation. So in the future, there's going to be a lot of clues that even I don't know the answer to.
Cool.
And I think that's necessary because like right now, if you think about it, like if I know where all the clues are, then I could always cheat. And so if there's like with this game, it's a decent likelihood we actually won't know who wins, right? Like if some team was quiet about it, we won't know. And so I'd like to have the ability to say like, hey, I could not have just like taken this money myself. And the way to get that is to, myself not know where some of the clues are.
How many keys have been found so far?
God, I think we're up to like 17 or 18 so far.
Okay. I remember I was following along for the at the beginning and I kind of stopped. I just remember at the beginning, someone like just found like 4 keys just by like, kind of like realizing that the URL scheme was of the website. You could just like get into the next clues and crack them and stuff. Was that intentional?
That one was intentional. So what we did is we had these clues that were hidden around the world, and you had to actually show up to the location in order to get a password that would let you into the page that has the key. And how that works is like there's this nice library called Crypto.js, and so you can like AES 256 encrypt a static HTML payload. And so the reason we chose that is like there's no backend to that, and so we don't have to worry about like script kiddies just like hammering our server all day. But of course, the downside of that is like because it's local, you can just brute force the hell out of it. And so for the ones where we don't want someone to do that, we have these like really, really long passwords that are really hard to brute force. But for this one, I thought it'd be funny to make it like just barely brute forceable, such that like someone who wants to actually go to the location can get the password, and then someone that's like lazy but knows how to use computers can just do that. And so like we hinted that in the clue that like someone that understood cryptography could like take a shortcut. And I expected that to take like a week, but in fact someone did it in like 40 minutes. And then like wrote up how he did it, which was cool. So yeah, that's not like something that works on the future clues, but it definitely worked on those 4.
I see. Yeah. Anyway, so I asked you to come on because this podcast is like my little side podcast because it's like I focus mostly on Epicenter, but this is my Epicenter is just a very formal professional thing where we have guests on, but here it's just like going to talk about random stuff I want to rant about. So you had this tweet just like or it's just like I guess a series of tweets in the last couple of days talking about like okay, so it's a weird topic, very different than the blockchain stuff we normally cover. We're going to talk about death. And so, yeah, right. How are you introduced it? What was it? Tell me about, you had this tweet about like, if you could live forever, if you were given the choice to live forever, why wouldn't you take it? And you thought that was like going to be an uncontroversial thing. First of all, why were you even thinking about this? How did this even come up?
I mean, I was having a discussion with someone. I have a lot of friends because I actually, in college, I studied synthetic biology. And so I have a lot of friends that work in the longevity field. And it's something we talk about a lot because they're like very serious about trying to increase human lifespan. And I was just thinking like, I try to be pretty like empathetic to other people's positions, but one of the positions I just really can't understand is like, if you had the ability to live forever and let's say like, just for the sake of discussion, like it's not you're living forever in like a decrepit state or something. You're not like wheelchair bound, like you're, and by the way, I would totally like, if I was in a wheelchair, if I was like completely unable to move but still alive, I would take that one too. But like, let's just Iron Man this argument and say like you're going to be in really, really good shape and you're just going to be like forever 30. I would totally take that, and I can't understand why anyone wouldn't. And so I tweeted that, and I expected it would get some pushback, but like it was funny because it got like 90 bajillion replies, and they were all negative. It was like all these people telling me, how horrible it would be to be alive for that long. And yeah, I don't know. It sparked off this interesting debate on Twitter about that.
What were people saying? Why would they not want to be alive for that long?
Well, so that's what I found so funny is that almost no one had a good argument. It was always just like, what gives human life meaning is that we die. And I was like, that's an aphorism that has no backing and is totally ridiculous. Like that means nothing. And like, in my opinion, I guess if you only like something because it's limited, then like you don't actually like that thing. It's just
I don't know. What about like marginal utility? I like 1 cup of ice cream. I would not like a million cups of ice cream in the next. Like that would suck.
But if you had the option to have ice cream whenever you wanted, you wouldn't like suddenly be like, oh man, ice cream sucks now.
Sure, but
like I'm not force feeding you ice cream, and so like I guess my take on this is that like definitionally life is extremely varied. So it's like life is not like ice cream every day. It's like you can do literally whatever you want. And so I guess to me I guess it reduces to this, right? Like I think any argument against living forever is also a pretty good argument for just like killing yourself right now.
Okay, I have to think about this. I disagree. Like what if you could have different moments in your life and like I might, so with the ice cream thing, like you said, I can stop having ice cream whenever I want, right? And I can have ice cream, I can put it off to later, but I don't know if you can't like put a temporary pause on living. Not something that living is the best, it's equivalent to eating ice cream, but what if like you had the ability to pause and then come back alive when you wanted to?
Yeah. I mean, so I think maybe there's like 3 different kinds of immortality we could talk about that are all pretty interesting. So there's the kind that we're most likely, although I concede at the moment we're very unlikely, but the most likely that we're going to achieve is like victory over cellular senescence. And so the idea there is like you're not going to die from aging, but like if you wanted to commit suicide, like if you jumped off a cliff, you're still going to die. And I think that's like, again, that's the most like scientifically likely one. And then there's like, some kind of supernatural immortality where like, even if you wanted to die, you can't. And then there's the scenario you just brought up where like, maybe we have some sort of cryogenic freezing. This is something I've talked with my partner, Dovey, about. What she wants to do is like, she wants to like get frozen and then come back every like 100 years and kind of like check on humanity, see what's going on. If it's cool, maybe she'll like hang out for a while. If it sucks, maybe she'll like go back on ice for a couple 100 years. And I think those are all like pretty distinct scenarios.
So was this brought up in your thing where like, I replied to that tweet or, one of them, and I to me, I think the question is like kind of pointless question where it was putting this hypothetical, which is like, yeah, to me, given the hypothetical, if given the option to live forever, would I take it? Probably yes. But I feel it's a scary question to be asking, because I think it just sets people down for like, false expectations, and just like might just let them down. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like how I would choose to do it is assume we can't live forever and live my life based off of that assumption. And if by the end of my life, oh great, we solved it, and you by the way, you can live forever. Oh, cool, nice. That was a nice surprise.
I would disagree with that. So I think a lot of people say, like, one of the things people said a lot was like, oh, if I could live forever, I'd just procrastinate on everything. And I think like, excuse me, as like a chronic procrastinator, I get that. On the other hand, I think like when humans do the most interesting and kind of most glorious things is when we're looking at a really, really long time horizon. And so because we die, that typically only happens when people think to the next generation. And so you see like, there's a lot of like the wonders of the ancient world were built over several generations. And I think that's always like really, really like a good mode for humans to be in. And I think so many of the things that we do that suck are a result of the fact that a lot of people think, well, I'm going to be dead by the time this is a problem anyway. And so, yeah, I mean, I think to the extent that like we could be freed up to say, okay, I'm going to work on this project for the next 400 years, you'd see a lot of really amazing stuff happen.
But here's the thing though, like, does that change your entire way of living? So clearly today, this like scientific immortality is not possible. And now, I think there's this question we're making a bet. The bet we're making is, I'm 21. So let's say I don't know, I don't know what the exact number is, but let's say the average lifespan is 80 years. And I'm making a bet. Will immortality be solved in the next 59 years? If so, the best thing for me to do is like hide away in my room and like protect myself from all possible dangers in the world, just so I can make sure I stay alive until that point where it is possible. But if I make the bet that it's not, then it's like, let me go enjoy my life right now.
Right. So I mean, I think that's a separate question. It's an interesting one though. The question is like, what's the likelihood that we're the last generation to die?
Yeah.
And I think at the moment the likelihood's pretty low, unfortunately. I think like we're actually really far off on all this stuff. And so the EV for someone, the expected value for someone of like, just being as safe as possible and not doing anything enjoyable is probably pretty low. It's probably going to end up being like a bad decision. But I think like you can imagine maybe a couple generations later when like it really looks like we might be close. I think that's actually like a really understandable position to take, is that like, hey, we're looking like we might really be on the cusp of immortality at this point. And so in order to get access to that, I'm going to like live a really boring life for the next 30 years or something. I don't think that's like crazy.
Sure. So my question is, okay, so what do you think? Do you think that we're, I don't know, how much older are you? Maybe like five years older than me? 10 years? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm 30.
Okay, sure. So, do you think it's going to be solved in the next 50 years?
I don't know, unfortunately. I mean, I could be wrong, but I mean, so I guess I do think it's plausible. I don't think it's supernatural to say that like we'll achieve victory over cellular senescence. There's a lot of organisms out there that are pretty close to that already, or at least are way further down on the spectrum from us. They're typically like, they're not especially complex organisms. But like the problems of complexity, the problems that like multicellular or like multi organ animals have compared to like really, I guess what I'm trying to get at is like the biggest problem is that your cells accumulate genetic damage and get screwed up. And so I think like we can deal with like organ problems or whatever it is if we can tackle the stuff at the cellular level. And I think we're going to get there. And I guess to me, like an important thing is to recognize this is something we want, right? And I think like at the moment, there's way too little resources being directed at aging and death, because we have this incredible case of Stockholm syndrome that was out in full force in response to my tweets, where people were like, no, like, death is what gives life meaning, or accepting death is great. And it's like, no, it's really not. Like, that sucks. It's like totally awful. We should be doing everything in our technological power to get rid of it. And we should, face up to the fact that like, yeah, it's utterly horrifying. Like, we're all going to die, and that totally sucks. And like, pretending that doesn't suck for the sake of our feelings is silly.
What if it sucks? Well, no, what if it's meaningless? What if they're saying like they're accepting that it'll happen in their lifetime, that it won't happen in their lifetime, And so that for them, it's worth it to not bother solving this problem. And to them, it's considered a waste of time.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a more nuanced position that I think I could get a little bit more behind. I think that's still like incredibly selfish. And like, you know, if anyone has kids, like, or even if you have like if you care at all about like subsequent generations, you should still, you know, encourage the allocators of capital to allocate capital to this, because like it matters. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a much better position than the position that was actually being advocated by most of these people, which is that like it would actually make life less interesting if you could live forever.
Okay, I see. So yeah, I feel like a lot of those people are just like haven't thought through it enough, maybe. Like,
yeah, I think so. I mean, well, the thing that I thought was funny is Arthur from Tezos said, you know, the number of people that say that they wouldn't take this compared to the number of people that would actually turn down immortality, you know, it's like a couple orders of magnitude different. And I think he's totally right about that.
So you think it's like a signaling thing?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's just like you said, like they haven't really thought through it very much.
Okay. Yeah, you know, I feel like so there's actually a term for this thing. It's called like death anxiety, and it's like it's a term in psychology, and there's this entire like book called Terror Management Theory, which basically it asserts that like the prime function of like culture is in order to like help us overcome our fear of death. And you know, I think there's like these interesting different stories that are told historically about like how we're going to overcome death. And I think most of them, you know, I think the current things that technologists say are often just, you know, rethinkings of those old ideas. Okay, so you know, here a couple of so there's 4 stories. Basically, I think there's the first one is the elixir, which is like, you know, the elixir of life or the fountain of youth, or you know, in Harry Potter, the philosopher's stone, like all these like magical like items that will somehow, if we you know, we promise we're going to solve it in this lifetime, and you know, if we can just solve it, it's going to be great. And then, you know, the one thing that all those people who tried to solve it have in common is that they're all dead today. And that, you know, I feel like
I would push back on this. I actually think that there's this really damaging trend in modern thinking of like trying to say, oh, everything's a story, everything's a narrative, this fits into that narrative. And I think, you know, technological progress is not a fucking story. It's an objective reality. And we're actually working on this stuff. And that it's like the sort of dismissive attitude of like, oh yeah, people have been promising immortality forever. Yeah. Like it's useful on the one hand because it allows you to say, okay, these people that are telling us we're going to get this tomorrow are probably scammers. On the other hand, it allows people to like dismiss out of hand real scientific work that's taking place. Yeah. And I think that's arguably some of the most important work that's happening. And so like when people are like, oh, this just fits into that story, I'm like, no, like again, it's not a fucking story.
Okay, that's fair. Well, interestingly, okay, I was going to say the fourth one. So, you know, I'll quickly run over the next 2 just to get those out of the way. Yeah. The second one is the resurrection story of Jesus, or, you know, the rapture of the Bible. And I think that, you know, the modern parallel to that is cryogenics. And then the last one is like the idea of a soul, which will transcend you. And I think that's, you know, we're going to upload our brain to the computer and we're all going to live there. You know, okay, get those out the window. Then the fourth one is legacy, right? And like the idea is that, okay, the legacy you leave might be able to outlive you. And that could be in 2 different ways. One is the biological legacy, but the other is part of this like movement, being part of a movement that's bigger than yourself, which is an interesting. And so, you know, Slate Star Codex?
Yep.
Yeah. So, you know, he has this one like really fun, like it's like a story, you know, it's not an article, like it's once it's like a story. It's called Ars Longa Vita Brevis. Very fascinating story. It's like, you know, it touches on the idea that I was thinking about like myself, but it's like, you know, how much can people possibly learn in a single lifetime? Like, you know, what if like we just keep pushing like a certain field so much that like, I don't know, a good field, like, I don't know, astrophysics. What if it just like, you know, it just takes your entire life to just learn everything that has been done so far in astrophysics that no one can actually push further on this. So he actually wrote a very interesting story that was the central theme of this story, is to explore that concept. But the example he uses is it's just like guild of alchemists who are trying to solve the elixir, and they basically like got this down to a science where like
Yeah, I read this. I remember. So
Okay.
my objection at the time to this was that it ignores sort of the value of abstraction, or maybe it just underestimates it. And I think like that's why we develop these abstractions, so that like if I'm a biologist, yeah, it's true that like I'm building upon physics and chemistry, but like I actually don't need to have an incredibly deep understanding of those things. Certainly not like a PhD thesis level understanding of those things. And like typically,
and I think like he uses architecture, and he's like, look, to be an architect, you don't have to understand everything. You can be the window architect, or you could be the columns architect. I think he mentioned that.
Right. I mean, I guess, but the sort of the conclusion is that that we're going to face this problem where like the amount of knowledge you need to even like get to the point where you can invent something new or think of something new is already like it increases unbounded. And I think it's a cool story. I don't think there's any like real reason to believe that. It certainly hasn't happened yet. Sure. We have observed like an increase though, right? That like, from the days when like you had all these gentlemen scientists who could just come up with like a breakthrough in a couple of years to now where like, you do a grad student degree and then you do a postdoc and then you're a professor and then like maybe you come up with something. So we're seeing that increase, and I can see like why that would freak him out. Sure. But I think, yeah, again, like I don't think we have any real reason to be like super alarmed about that yet.
So, I mean, the part of the story that I wanted to bring up specifically, though, I think the learning stuff is an interesting thought experiment. But what I found particularly interesting, the example he used was like alchemists, or we'll call them chemists today, like trying to solve this elixir of life. And I was like, wow, wait, all these people. So, like, using their prediction modeling, they were able to predict that, we're not 100% of the way there yet, and we're probably not going to solve it in our lifetime. And so I'm like, oh man, these guys are probably so depressed because like their entire life was engineered in order to solve something that won't be attainable in their lifetime. And but then it made me think like maybe that's fine. Maybe it's part of like that fourth style of like solving the problem, which is being part of the legacy, and maybe like being. So what your point was about not having it like technology isn't a narrative. Maybe it should be a narrative because that's what encourages us to continue pushing it forward.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think even if you reject the whole narrative framework, and whether you should or not, but I mean, even if you're trying to live like according to whatever is going to get you or people you like closest to eternal life, it's it's totally reasonable to say, okay, I'm not going to get this in this lifetime, but I'm going to contribute towards the knowledge we need for it. And that's probably the most honorable thing someone could do, in the case where they're not going to actually be part of that cohort. And I think, I mean, it's like an interesting point, right? That like, it's really hard for humans who are going to die to think in terms of extremely long-term goals. But part of why we want to increase human lifespan is to make that easier. So like part of that bootstrapping process is just to live as if you're going to live forever, even if you're not. And then eventually people actually will.
Yeah. See, I don't know. So once again, so you're suggesting the opposite of what I was suggesting, which is I said, live as if you're not going to live forever and be pleasantly surprised if you are. And so you're saying instead give me the pitch on why I should live as if I'm going to live forever.
Well, I guess so. If you were going to live forever, you would care a lot about super long-term issues. If you were going to imagine you were going to live for 1,000 years, like you would think a lot about like how to increase longevity, because like you're going to be around for a long time. You got a long time to work on this hard problem.
So and is this basically a good narrative trick, that like a psychological trick we should be using on like the masses in order to make them think long term?
So that's what I guess I'm really resistant to that. This is something that's become so popular. I think it's all Cass Sunstein's fault. He wrote this book called Nudge. And there's this huge, people love this, like, we're going to behaviorally engineer other people to like think in this way that's beneficial for the masses. And like, no, I mean, I think people should come to their own conclusions about this stuff. And I think one like admirable and potentially very rewarding conclusion to come to is like, this is probably not going to get done in my lifetime, but I'm not just going to sit on the sidelines and say like, oh, actually it's awesome to die. Dying is what gives life meaning. I'm going to like do something about it. And yeah, I mean, I think I have like a huge amount of respect for my friends that are working on longevity stuff. It seems like it's one of the most important, if not the most important problems.
So going back to a thing that you mentioned a few minutes ago about wanting to do it for maybe for your children or your next generation. why, this is like a question I've just been like trying to understand myself, is why do people care about what happens? Maybe, maybe you have a connection to your children, or maybe your grandchildren. If you're lucky, hopefully your great grandchildren. But like, why do people care for anything that happens more than one or two generations ahead? And but what's happening then is, by the time that those people are alive, then like, okay, they're caring about two generations ahead. And has humanity just been surviving off of caring two generations ahead? Like,
Yeah, totally, dude. I mean, again, this is from my biology background, but like evolution is this incredibly like coarse mechanism that just, it's not like, I think like it would be a better description of like how natural selection works is it's like survival of the fuckingest. Like it's not the fittest, right? Like it's just like whatever reproduces the most and then ensures that its offspring like stays alive long enough to do the same. And so it makes a lot of sense that like we care about our direct offspring because like we are the ones that survived because we cared about that. And then, extrapolating from that, because we're capable of higher reason, we think, well, I seem to have this I inherently really care about my kids. And like, it kind of makes sense to care about my grandkids too. And maybe I actually feel that. And then maybe you extrapolate from those feelings and you say, well, this is actually a good thing. And I'm also going to care about like even these like far future generations.
So does this mean that, would that mean that we, how we're going to solve problems that require more than two generations of coordination? So climate change, for example.
Well, so I mean, I think the realistic answer is we're not. I mean, historically, we have a really fucking bad record of solving those problems. And that's another reason that we should all care a lot about extending lifespan, is that like, it seems like it might actually be easier to defeat cellular senescence than it is to get people to give a shit about stuff that happens after they die.
Right. Okay. So I feel there's like a circle here where it's like, okay, no, okay, I understand. Okay. I feel there's just a little bit of a mental jump, or not jump. To your point, yeah, maybe we're not trying to delude others, but there is some level of deluding myself that has to go on here, because no matter how hard, how maybe if I learn and read more and more of like the current breakthroughs in science, maybe I'll, it seems you probably do more of than I do, but like maybe I could be convinced otherwise. But how about this? If you had to give a probability on it, level 1 immortality being solved in the next 50 years, what would your probability be?
Level 1 is like just that we don't age anymore.
Yeah.
In the next 50 years, I would say like, a fraction of a percent.
Fraction of a percent. Yeah. So, okay. So we should, what percentage of society's resources, I guess we should be maximizing that. I don't know.
Well, here's the issue though. I mean, so whenever people ask, like the allocation question is always a really hard one, because we allocate so much money to so many stupid fucking things that like when someone asks like how much should we allocate to this like actually pretty good thing, the answer is like a ton, because like right now we allocate all this money to like almost useless things. It's a harder question when you say, okay, like imagine a society that already allocates pretty damn well but doesn't allocate very much to this. Should we like, by what amount should we increase this allocation? And I think that's like a much harder question that we're probably not going to answer in a single podcast.
Sure. No, I think we can solve society's problems in a single podcast. So that's interesting. So basically the only way past our only of solving large scale generational problems is to figure out how to expand life, or at the very least have people think that we're going to be able to expand lifetimes.
Well, no, I mean, the other thing is, look, I mean, all you have to do is want that thing. I mean, so like humans have in fact worked on multi-generational projects before. Like the canonical example is that in Europe, people built these, gorgeous cathedrals that took 2 to 3 generations to build. And that's because they thought that building something beautiful to glorify God was something that they wanted to do. And so I think, what was depressing about that tweet was that a lot of people came out and said, well, we don't even really want to live forever. Like, that's actually not even a good thing. We don't even want that. And I think that really is, to me, this like just incredibly depressing Stockholm syndrome that people have about death, where they just think that it's impossible. And so maybe like a pretty high leverage move would be to say, okay, actually, like, here's all this longevity research we're doing, and it's making serious progress. So this is not something that's totally inevitable that you should just acquiesce to. It's actually pretty possible that within a few generations we could be living, greatly increased lifespans.
question. So, how should I balance my time between? So, there's the okay, I want to work on something that's greater than me, and hopefully work on something that's greater than me. Work on helping push forward like longevity and pure hedonism. And for example, I ride a motorcycle, which is probably the dumbest thing I could do. From like if I want a chance of living another 50 years, like, probably the dumbest thing I'm doing. But it's so much fun, and it's like I don't know, like
So
how do I know whether or not to do that?
The motorcycles example is an interesting one because I think genetically I have like an absurdly high risk tolerance. Like it's just really, really like dangerously high, and that reflects in like what I do, which is early stage investment. It reflects in like how I'll cross the street against a red light. I used to love to skateboard. My dad's a skydiver. Like we're from a family that has tweaked risk tolerance, but riding motorcycles is the one thing I won't do. I won't do it because it's like it's so fucking dangerous. And it's not like actually like skydiving is one of those things where people have a they have a high overestimate of how dangerous it is. Skydiving is actually pretty safe. Right. But I don't know, I have all these like ER doctor friends who are like, just whatever you do, don't ride a motorcycle. So that's like one of the few things that I really do abstain from in the interest of living a longer life.
Sure. So when you do these risk-taking things, maybe not motorcycling, but anything else, how do you know how much, like, in theory, it's like, if you're doing like some sort of pro and cost benefit analysis, like, there's the fun that you're having, and which, let's say skydiving. I don't know what the statistics are on skydiving. It's like maybe 99.99999% chance you're fine. And so, and you multiply that by the amount of fun you're going to have doing it. And then you multiply that 0.001% times, the con, which is death. But I think that death has an infinite.
I think a less quantitative approach that's maybe easier for people to think about is like, there's a lot of things that are really fun that aren't that risky. And so like, it's kind of like an economic, like there's a lot of substitute goods for these things that are really risky. So like, I'm sure doing crystal meth is like super awesome, but like, there's also a lot of other things that are really awesome that don't potentially lead to psychosis or jail time. And so as a result, like I choose those goods instead of crystal meth. And I think that's true for a lot of like dangerous activities, is that like, there's a lot of other things that you can do that are also really fun. I think that's maybe not true for some people. So like Alex Honnold is the person that would come to mind, the guy that like free soloed El Capitan and like climbs up buildings with no ropes in his spare time. Like that guy has a shrunken amygdala. And for him to feel like the sort of the normal, like, yeah, that felt great, he needs to do something super crazy. And like, so for people like that, the calculus is different. But I think for a lot of people, like you can be very happy doing pretty safe stuff. And like, if living a long time is something you're interested in, you should probably think about that.
Okay. Okay, so in any conversation about this, which I'm not sure if it came up in the tweet, there's like, the obvious one topic that, sometimes maybe didn't come up because it's considered too taboo, but like, what I'm probably going to say, suicide. How does that reconcile with your claim, with the claims?
Oh, I don't think there's any conflict there. So I think like, sometimes suicide, probably the majority of the time, suicide is the, the end state of depression or of like other, abnormal mental states. And my mom's a psychologist, and I think like from my observation of people around me that were severely depressed, like it's much better modeled as a disease than it is modeled as like just a mood, right? And so when people think of it as like, oh, like being depressed is just like being really sad, it's like, no, like, it's this whole complicated like neurochemical state that leads to a bunch of really bad things. And so like, that's probably most of suicide. But then like, there's probably some
a rational decision maker who's coming to that conclusion.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think so. There's probably some rational suicides though, right? Like that definitely happens. Like there's people who, choose to be euthanized when they're in like a ton of pain, or there's people that commit suicide as like a protest against something. And like, I don't think, martyrdom, like these are all like interesting things. I don't think they have anything to do with like defeating aging though.
Sure. I mean, yeah. The people, a martyr who like purposely martyrs themselves, I think they're just going all in on the strategy number 4, which is the legacy one, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
What do you think is the role? So, okay, how do you think, for example, the thing about cathedrals and stuff that you were saying, right? Part of it is, maybe they wanted to leave a legacy for build something beautiful. But part of it was also, to appease God so they can get into heaven. And now, there's a global decrease in religiousness in the world over the last.
Well, so hold on. I would push back on that. Okay. So I don't think there was no religion that I know of that built cathedrals that was it's preconditioned to heaven. You have to build a cathedral. The way to get into heaven was to believe in God for the most part. But I think a big part of why people build those things and why people work on any big multi-generational project is it's kind of like a proof of work. So it's if you're born into a generation when these monumental things exist and you look at them and you're like, wow, not only did some guy care enough to build this, multiple generations of guys and girls cared enough and thought this was important enough. And that's an incontrovertible proof of work. And so maybe you look at that and you're like, wow, I should consider whether this thing is in fact super important.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. It's proof of work for a society or a civilization.
Right.
Okay. Why? Okay. Maybe to take a little a divergent path, another topic, which I think is maybe in the realm of why do your proof of work of your society is to show how much work your civilization has put into this thing. But if we have the ability, why do we need that? Why do we need to have that sort of proof of work? And if we can create,
because convincing people of anything is really hard. So if you tell someone hey, belief in God is really important, they're like, yeah, all right. And you're like, yeah, actually I go pray every day because I think believing in God's really important. They're like, man, that's a big hassle. Maybe it's really important. And if you're like, hey, by the way, I also devoted my entire life and someone before me also devoted their entire life to building this monument to God, then you're like, well, shit. I mean, clearly, at least you really care. There's no chance that you're just trying to fool me into caring about this thing that doesn't actually matter because you went all in on it. And I think that's it's just a very convincing argument.
Okay. Maybe what if what if the best way to make sure in that stage 1 style immortality, right? You said we stop natural aging, but if we jump off a bridge, that would still be bad. But I imagine if I crash my motorcycle, it would also still be bad. So do you think the best solution is for us all to sit in VRs, in the Matrix, so that way our cellular bodies can remain as safe as possible, and then we experience everything mentally through magic.
I mean, I think that's a whole nother question. I don't find it as abhorrent as some people seem to. I think actually, dude. I mean, so I tried the Oculus Quest fairly recently, and I hadn't tried VR since God. I mean, when I last tried it, it was at this at a cyber cafe that was in Palo Alto at the time called Cybersmith, and I want to say that was literally in the year 2000. And VR at that point was a bunch of vector lines and you could shoot pterodactyls and shit. And it was super, super, super not immersive. And I put on the Quest and I was like, holy shit, this is amazing. I mean, it was incredibly immersive. And of course, the immersion was still garbage compared to what you'd want for a Matrix situation. But having tried that, I could totally see a world in which, virtual realities were so immersive that a lot of people would choose to not face the dangers of the real world and to just live in VR. Yeah, sure.
Okay, I think that I agree with you. I'm completely in agreement. I think that people are the way the Matrix movie had portrayed it was I don't know. I think it is a reasonable choice to do as long as people are given the option to be aware of the fact that they're in the Matrix. But otherwise, I think it's fine.
Let's break that down for a second. So what was wrong? What sucked about the Matrix? I mean, first of all, you weren't aware. There was this undertone of you're getting exploited. The reason that you're in the Matrix is so the machines can harvest your body energy for electricity, which by the way, I think was it's a really annoying. I had a big time suspending disbelief there. Why do they need this incredibly inefficient energy source? And then I read, I think in the source text or in the original script, they actually were using human brains for processing power, which at least made a little bit more sense. Right. So there's this idea that it kind of sucks you're getting exploited, and then there's also you don't have any power over your reality in the Matrix any more than you do in real life. Whereas in an actual virtual reality environment, presumably you could manipulate your environment much more than you can in the real world. And so that's kind of a check mark in its favor that you can actually design the world that you want to live in.
It sounds pretty
So
cool,
yeah,
right? Because like,
absolutely.
that's how you get as close to post scarcity as possible. And if anyone can just create anything they want, that sounds pretty cool. Maybe a little bit lonely, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think at some point, like maybe the only scarce resource is processing power, and we start building Dyson spheres around suns or whatever.
That's where Bitcoin comes in. Maybe
Yeah, you need 1 Bitcoin can buy you the sun's output for a year.
Yeah, but you need some proof of useful work then.
Proof of useful work for what?
Like compute in the VR stuff that gives you like a proof of useful work that you can then spend and give to others.
Maybe, yeah, maybe we just stick to Bitcoin.
Okay. Well, then we're wasting compute power that could have been gone into powering the matrix. We're using it on this like Bitcoin silly useless thing.
Right. Yeah, could be.
Any plans of putting any keys in VR?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something we're working on.
Working on.
It's not trivially easy.
Sure.
And we want to make it cool. But yeah, it's definitely something we're working on.
What's your, you want to give a hint of like what's an interesting key that's coming up?
Yeah, there's a couple of kind of interesting ones I can talk about. So, and by the way, like talking about this means that like everyone playing Satoshi's Treasure is going to listen to this podcast to try to get.
Okay, yeah, you should give out a clue. My other podcast of this one, like 200 views, 300 views. This one, 100,000.
Yeah. So it's not. I mean, this isn't like giving anything away, but like 2 things we're working on that we're excited about are, right now we have, I think some of the most fun clues that we do are these ones where like there's an offline component, so you have to actually go to some place in the world. And what that typically, how that happens is like, since people are mostly playing this game as clans, there'll be like some member of the clan that happens to be near that place, but sometimes they're like not that near. Like we had a key in this like yoga retreat in India, and like someone traveled like a day away from like Delhi to get there. So it's like people are pretty into it, but it's fun because like the whole clan will be watching, and like the guys like going to hunt for the key. So the thing that's tough about those keys is that we have to actually have a local presence on the ground to do them. There's like, it's very symmetric. Like the amount of effort they require to solve is roughly the amount of effort we put in to do them. And so we're working on ways of doing like verified location so that we can say, okay, this key is only available to you when you are in this place, but we don't actually have to point a physical key there. And it turns out that's like a really hard problem. And there's some blockchain people that are trying to solve it, the foam guys. There's some centralized solutions around GPS. And so there's a lot of kind of stuff that we're working on there, but that's something we're thinking a lot about because the offline component is so fun, and we want to be able to do a lot more of it than we can, with our current bandwidth.
Do you think going to the location is the hard? Like, I feel like, I used to do like a lot of geocaching when I was younger.
Yeah.
And, finding your way to the GPS spot is like half the fun. And then the other half is you still have to find the thing in that geography because, it's usually hidden under like a rock or something, So I feel just using the foam method, just like being the GPS coordinator, that takes out half the fun, right?
Yeah, so I agree with that. I think where it gets more fun though is when it's not single player. So what's cool is like, imagine a multiplayer clue where we said, okay, you have to go form a giant smiley face in these various coordinates. And like once you have someone in each one of these coordinates, the key will unlock. Like I think like everything, like the multiplayer is always more fun than the single player. But I agree with you. Yeah, like actually hunting for the thing is fun. Right now, like our designer, my co-founder Adam, who's just like one of the most talented designers I've ever worked with. He's made these like really cool stickers, and we're gonna start like color coding them for different hunts and stuff. And so like it's fun for people to have to go like hunt those down. And I think at some point we might do like actual buried treasure. We're like working on some fun stuff in that regard. But yeah, I mean, so that there's that kind of clue. And then the other thing that we found that's really fun is like, these cryptographic challenges that are like intentionally really, really hard to solve. So there was one that I thought was like just pretty fucking brutal, and it got solved recently. And then there's another one we're working on. I've been chatting with this guy, Ron Rivest, who's a professor at MIT. He's like the R in RSA. And he came up with a really cool puzzle for MIT, which was they had a time capsule that I think they wanted to last for 30 years. And so he made this problem that was like inherently sequential. So there's no way to like parallel process it. And based on his estimation for Moore's law, he was like, this should take 30 years. And then a French guy, and then also these guys at Protocol Labs solved it way faster than that. I think like 15. It took them like 50. It took 15 years for the thing to get solved. It didn't take them 15 years. They worked on it for like a year or something. And so Protocol Labs used an FPGA, and the guy that actually solved it before them just used like an i7 or something and just cranked on it. But he got a head start. So yeah. I mean, I think like that kind of thing is really fun, and we'll do stuff like that for sure.
What happened to you? You mentioned your co-founders, Nate. Wasn't part of it going to be a not? I remember you were telling me one that there's going to be like a business card one where you got to collect the business cards from everyone. How'd that one go?
Yeah. It's still happening. So that's just kind of like a funny Easter egg, is that we had this amazing girl in Brooklyn who has this like crazy warehouse with all sorts of interesting equipment, including a giant laser cutter. We had her laser cut us these like really sick, like transparent business cards with QR codes on them. And like, I'm not going to say what you have to do to them to like reveal the QR code, but you have to like do something to them, and then the QR code becomes available. And so like everyone that's on the core team has one of these cards. And if you can get all of them, then that's actually a key in itself. And so I've tried to be a little cagey about who I'm working with on this, just so it's harder to find those. But I think, I can say like that one of my co-founders' names is Adam without revealing too much. But yeah, I mean, we've given out a couple of those. I don't think anyone has gotten all of them yet. Some of the team members have been much quieter than the others, and so like there's some of those like my business cards are not that hard to get because I'm like fairly public, but like some of the people are much harder to find.
How many team members are there?
I don't know, Sonny.
Okay. Right. How is the team forming going? Like, one of the goals here was to get like large like coalitions going. How is that? Are we seeing like a lot of team
building? It's going really well. It's really interesting. I mean, so like there's the ones that everyone sees. So like one of the most public ones, these guys called Toshi Ciphers, and they've committed to releasing every key that they find. And so whenever they find a key, they make it public, which I think as an early game strategy is actually not insane. And so here's why. So like there's a 400 key threshold, right? So you can assume that like any of the keys that are in the early game are solvable, even if they're really hard. They're probably going to get solved by multiple people before the 400th clue comes out, so they're not unique. And so if your goal is just to get an enormous coalition of super smart people together very quickly, then like you just be super public until like key 100. And I don't, by the way, I have no idea if this is actually their strategy. They might just like keep releasing them the whole time. But like, I think what might happen, they might come to this conclusion independently, which is like, once we've got 100 keys, now we have this like giant clan full of smart people. Okay, now we're not releasing keys anymore. And now we're going to start keeping keys for ourselves. So I don't know, like the dynamics around that are really interesting. There's also a lot of like really small clans that people don't know about, but that contact me occasionally. And I think of it kind of like as an iceberg. So like there's the visible part, all these like really public clans, and then there's this like massive amount of like very quiet people that are like, very seriously playing the game.
You think what do you think is the primary motivating factor for most of the people? Is it the money or just the fun of the game?
I think it's the fun, man. I think it's the fun because the world is like unfortunately fairly boring for a lot of people, and so like when there's something like this, it gives you this sense of like magic. And there's actually one of the things that like really influenced me to make this was Moxie Marlinspike, the guy that runs Signal, had this great blog post about magic, and where he got like the sense of magic was like him and his friends used to sneak into movie theaters, and they had all these like interesting ways of sneaking into movie theaters. And then there was this one movie theater that I couldn't sneak into, and they found out about this thing called a bump key. Which is just like a key that has a whole bunch of like protrusions on it, and you like kind of hammer it into the lock. And for like shitty locks, it'll just bump it open. And when they had that, they were like, yes, it was like a sense of magic. Like now, like any lock is like openable by our like magic spell. And so I think people get that same sense with this, where it's like there's this whole nother layer in the world now of like these clues, and they're all over the place. They're global. Some of them require computer science skills. Some of them require, knowledge of Chinese classical poetry. Whatever it is, and like it's this game that people are actually playing. And I think like one of the most fun things for me, and I think also for players, is like when you convert on some physical location clue and then you see someone else there, and it like shakes you out of this sort of solipsism that you might be living in, where you're like, oh shit, there's other people playing this is like totally real, it's happening. And that's like really fun.
Okay. Has there been any pushing the boundary, like what happens when it comes to like travel to like restricted countries kind of thing, like
so we're not gonna do any of that just for like every reason that you can think of, right? Like we're not gonna put any clues that are in really dangerous locations. We've committed to not putting any clues on private property, I think I need to amend that rule a little bit, because like there's times where I want to put a clue like in a cafe or something, which is like technically private property, but it's like relatively open to the public. So I think we'll change that to something like, we're not going to put any clues in places where you're not welcome. Like we don't want people like breaking into places or anything.
Couldn't you just get the property owner's permission?
Yeah, but I mean that's not really like, I don't know. Yeah, like something like that, right? Like we'll come up with some way to phrase this that makes sense. But basically, like we don't want you breaking in. The only time I was like really tempted to have hunters break in somewhere is in New York. There's this park called Gramercy Park, and it's like it's fenced off, and it's only for like the extremely wealthy residents of the homes directly around that park. But it's a private park; you're not allowed in. And I was like, "Fuck these guys!" Like it would be so funny to put a clue in there, and then like all these like scrappy nerds are gonna break into their stupid park. And then I was like, yeah, but I can't do that because like it would be like violating this rule that I think is actually important for other reasons. So like forget about it.
I see. Yeah. I mean, so have you heard of Unisocks?
No.
Unisocks are, Uniswap. So Uniswap is this
socks. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So he has the socks, and basically he mints these tokens, and you burn a token, he'll send you the pair of socks, and it's trading against a Uniswap bonding curve. And they started at like $12. They're trading at like over $100 now, over $50,000 of daily sock trading.
Right.
But Phil Dye and I was hanging out with Hayden and Phil a couple of weeks ago, and Phil, as you would expect Phil to do, the first thing he does is start thinking of ways to break it. And he's like, well, what if I burn it and ask you to ship socks to like Iran or something, or like something like sanctioned? And like, or the other one he came up with was like, I'm just like gonna like get a bunch of socks sent to me, then like put out a restraining order, like this weird dude just keeps sending me socks, and then have you keep sending socks to me. So
I mean that's like the classic online offline problem with blockchains and smart contracts, is like the second that they start interacting with the real world, nothing is very smart contracty anymore, right? It's not immutable. There's all sorts of weird stuff that could happen.
Have you had any clues geographically located in China yet?
Yeah, actually, the very first clue was we sent out this transmission on the Blockstream satellite, and we gave people a bunch of GPS coordinates where they could just directly find a clue. And there was one in Beijing that a bunch of people found, which was fun. We're going to do a lot more in China for sure. We're going to do a lot of them. We have one coming up, I think, in Tokyo. That'll be really cool, because Tokyo is like my favorite city on the planet, and there's just so many interesting things we could do there.
Why? Why Tokyo? Why is Tokyo your favorite?
Why is Tokyo my favorite? Man, I mean, there's so many reasons. So like, first of all, it's an incredibly delicious city. Like the food is amazing. People there, like, there's this website called tabelog.com, Tabelog. And it's like their Yelp. And like on Yelp, like the Yelp rating is actually only is like from 3 stars to 4 stars. Cause like people don't actually give like very careful ratings, and also people massively inflate ratings. So like if a restaurant is like 3 stars, that's like terrible on Yelp. Like you would never want to eat at a place that's like 3.0, unless it's a Chinese place where there's lots of white people, because like white people will rate Chinese restaurants bad because of service, which is just on face stupid. So like my favorite Chinese place in the city is like a 3.2 or something, and it's like insanely delicious. And if you read the low ratings, they're like, they were so rude to me, and like, oh, it was the best meal I've ever had. They were so rude. Here's a 3. But anyway, the reason I bring this up is that in Japan on Tabelog, like a 3.0 is a very solid restaurant. And a 4.2 is like mind blowing. Like it's probably 2 Michelin stars, like just killer. And so I like that. Like it's a very rigorous food culture. The city itself is like, it's so beautifully designed. And it's not, the key part here is it's not centrally planned. So it's like, it's this very organic city that grew up according to a set of sort of like, very well-designed rules. And as a result, it's just a joy to get around. So like, you can be if you're on Google Maps and like you're in some like, kind of far-flung suburb of Tokyo, and you're like, man, it looks like I'm really far from like Shibuya, which is kind of like the central areas. You're like actually only 30 minutes from Shibuya on like a super fast, super comfortable air-conditioned subway. So it's really fun in that regard. And, that's because like, so an interesting thing about Tokyo is that unlike the US, where like, in San Francisco, we have the Sunset, with the exception of one, like big, like the exception of Taraval or like one of these big corridors, there's like these huge chunks of it that are just purely residential. And in Tokyo, they're really rare, because how Tokyo zoning works, or actually how zoning works in all of Japan, and I think it's a really good way to do it, is every zoning category is inclusive of every zoning below it. And so what I mean by that is like if a zone is zoned for light industrial, it's also okay to build cafes there, and it's also okay to build straight up residential housing there. And if something's zoned for commercial, then you can also build housing there. And I think the only two exceptions to that are like there is a purely residential zone, and since there's like nothing below that, that's just residential only, but those are pretty rare. And then the other one is like, you know, super heavy industry or whatever. Like if you're, you know, it's a refinery or something, I don't think you can like build other stuff near that. But in general, there's like incredibly mixed zoning, and so like the city is just really fun. Like wherever you're living, there's like a great bar super near you. There's like a bunch of great restaurants super near you. There's a supermarket. It's just like mad convenient.
Right. I've not been to Japan yet, but I'm going to be going for DevCon.
Oh, dude, let's go together. I would love to take you to Tokyo sometime. It's in Osaka, right?
Yeah, but yeah.
I might. When is it? October or something?
November? October. No, October. It's early October.
Let me see if I can do it. I really want to. I mean, it's a really interesting place, and like I've been going there since freshman year of college, and I love the place. I don't think I'd want to live there though, which is an interesting caveat because you know, like really mainstream Japanese culture to me is like pretty repressive and sad, and it's like you know people are massively overworked, and there's this like really intense strain of sort of conformism. But what's really interesting about that is that Japan has the most interesting subcultures of any place I've ever been to, because people like they get so into something. Like, I mean, anime is the one that everyone knows about, but like, God, anything from like there's a whole subculture of people in Japan that are really into making these like really beautiful planted fish tanks. And like in the US, that would be like, yeah, I have like a fish tank in my house. Like I like fish, whatever. But in Japan, like there's people that like, that's their hobby. And they spend like 40% of their disposable income on making like the most gorgeous fish tanks you've ever seen. And there's like supply stores where you can like buy all the stuff you need for like the world's most gorgeous fish tank. And like all their friends are like other fish tank people. And like, that's just really cool. Like if you're into like culture at all, like you go there and like, you can just see these people that are like super into this one thing and have raised it to an absolute art. And I've just, had a lot of fun with that.
Yeah. I mean, I listened to a podcast called Hardcore History, and you know, he's doing the current one is on like the rise of the Japanese Empire. And he was just like, Japan is just like, they take everything, but like notch it up a level.
Yeah, totally. Well, dude, I mean, the other funny anecdote I have from Tokyo is that the very first time I ever went there, I was staying in this neighborhood called Meguro that's like fairly central. It's kind of a sleepier neighborhood, but it's like real close to, you know, the whole like Shibuya and Omotesando like nexus. And I was super hungry, and right next to our hotel was a French restaurant. And I was like, yeah, like French food in Asia is probably not going to be great, but I'm starving, so let's go here. And I had actually just come off of spending a summer in Paris. And the meal that I had there was way better than anything I had in France. And it was not like Japanese French fusion or something. It was like ultra traditional French food. And it was perfect. Like everything was insane. The ingredients were insane. It was just so good. And so like I was so impressed. I like went back into the kitchen after the meal and I asked the chef, I was like, this is so good. Like how did you end up opening like a classical French restaurant in Tokyo? And she was like, oh, I lived in Nice for 15 years. And like I learned how to like cook every one of these dishes from like, you know, people there. And then I took this to Tokyo, and like there's just this huge drive there, especially in the food culture, to make something and then make it like perfect.
Cool. Yeah. All right. Well, you know, we're running out of time. We're almost hitting the 1 hour. One question I'd like to ask, just you know, kind of going back to the original premise is, so, you know, what do you want to be remembered for? Like if you're gonna, you know, dedicate resources to strategies 1, 2, 3, and, you know, 5, which is hedonism, what is your strategy for number 4? What is the legacy you want to leave?
Yeah, I couldn't care less about that. I have no strategy for 4. I think the Stoic philosophers had this right that, like, you know, fame is meaningless even while you're alive, and is like extremely meaningless.
Legacy could be more than just that, right? It could be biological legacy, for example, or it could be.
Okay. Well, if we're doing that, I mean, I want my kids to be well adjusted and happy, and I think, you know, I have a lot of we should do a future podcast on like how to raise kids, because I got a bunch of you know.
I would know nothing about this.
Yeah. But no, I mean, you know, of course I want what's best for my kids and for kind of everyone in that generation. But I think just in general, like I never think
movement, like, you know, what about like being part of, like, you know, nationalism? That's a movement that is like, or just being part of, it doesn't have to be your personal legacy. It can also be part of a movement that's also larger than you.
Yeah. I mean, I hope I inspire more people to like want to live longer, because I think
Mm.
being alive is pretty enjoyable, and like of enjoyable things we should take as much as we can. But I think maybe another one is like, I think the demise of nationalism is something I'm happy to be a part of. I think that's certainly something that technologists are doing, whether we're trying to or not. Is like, I feel much more in common with like another Bitcoiner from like Lithuania than I do with like your average American. Maybe this is like a California thing. I feel like Bay Area people, like, I feel a lot in common with like the rest of the Bay Area. Like, I don't have any problem with Americans, but like, I feel like zero affinity for America either. So yeah, I think nationalism, in its historical context, was in many ways a very useful and a good thing, as it replaced tribalism, but like, it's very much outlived its usefulness, and I hope we can get rid of it as soon as possible.
All right. Well, I would love to do a whole other podcast talking.
Yeah, dude, let's just keep doing these where we just like get on this and like shoot the shit. I think it's super fun.
Yeah, cool. All right. Well, thanks for coming on this time, and I hope you yeah, you're right. We should just keep doing this more often. So,
and let's do it in person next time. Like, we can get some beers and like actually hang out somewhere in real life, because I think those are even more fun.
Cool. That'd be sick. Yeah, I did the last one with Drew from Edgeware. Did that live, and that was kind of fun.
Sick. Yeah, we should totally do that.
Great. Well,
cool.
Here's to living forever or die trying.
Yeah, I love it. Talk to you later, man. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye.